So, Alan, and both you and Valerie talked about the importance and trust with stakeholders, understanding who are the stakeholders and the myriads that you listed, and then building up the trust and dealing with them. My question for the panel is, though, there's this myriad of interests, and many of them, I presume, would conflict. So how do you sort that out, the conflicting interests that you have to deal with in terms of stakeholders? Are some more important than others? How do you prioritize? How do you deal with those sort of issues up at the board level?
Well, I'll be blunt as I usually am. From a mining perspective, we prioritize the local community top because that blocks your road. If the local community blocks your road, the government will not do anything about it. And so that is the highest priority that you can possibly have. And then it goes down to those people that really don't have a direct interest in your business. We in the Constantia situation, we thought it was 10 miles. It's actually 150 miles that we have to look at. And our local community down there is a long way away. But to some extent, you're looking over your shoulder at who has got leverage over you. And local community has leverage, and then the government has leverage. In a mining situation, your permit exists at the pleasure of the government. And we've seen many companies, mining companies, have their projects simply ripped away from them if they haven't paid attention.
Other thoughts on the panel?
Yeah, I mean, building on that point, it's the concept of, again, you won't know if you're sitting in a vacuum and you're not engaging. So you do need to understand and map out who are the stakeholders that are important, engage and have a discussion to be able to understand what are the issues that are of importance to them and why. And then it's the soul searching, the reflection on which ones are material within the business context of my organization. Are we going to grow? Which stakeholders are going to be important in terms of enabling growth, attracting the best talent in terms of our organization, allowing us to better position ourselves in our products. So based on that, think of it as a funnel effect, but ultimately what you should be ending up with is, call it a materiality matrix or something that helps you organize your thinking. Which ones are of issue to whom, and then what are we going to do about them? How are we going to help monitor, disclose, and then report on them? But ultimately, it's got to start with information. That information is gained by engaging.
Yeah, I think for the retail sector, really, I mean, it is doing that full scan so that you can identify what are the specific social issues that you as a retailer have. And are they within, if you're working in smaller communities, then that becomes a huge priority. But now retail today, of course, is through e-commerce and becomes international, so that it is incumbent upon retail to identify those key areas where they can make a difference within the communities, but then back along the distribution chain, right back to suppliers, the retailer becomes responsible for the goods that they buy, and even after they're purchased by the consumer.
So Alan, I'm picking up, you mentioned in your talk that clearly the boards need to appreciate that there's dollars involved in this. There's payments, and then we've talked about the community of interest. So as you're sitting there, how do you distinguish between what's in the community interest versus, my words, a shakedown that's taking place? How do you draw those lines?
Well, obviously we go into all of these discussions and negotiations with a mind that there is a legitimate interest with respect to communities, and clearly, as I said, we're in areas where there are very disadvantaged populations. So have we been involved in shakedowns? I can't say that we have, but clearly there is a two-pronged approach to the sharing of benefits, and something that we're very cautious on. As I said, I mentioned the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There is a limitation to what you can do. The IFC has some standards on how you develop projects. So we maintain that. I think one thing I should just mention here is, and board members can make this mistake of framing these sorts of issues in Bay Street terms. And so I think we have to be very careful not to think that everybody on the other side has the same motivation perhaps as some of our local investment bankers. So often it's something other than money that actually is the requirement from a community, and we shouldn't make the mistake of putting them in the frame that we ourselves might be in.
Let me just shift gears a little bit, because our audience are directors and thinking about what are their responsibilities. You alluded to some of that, Alan, in terms of board roles and responsibilities. But first question, where do you start drawing the line between what management does versus the board? Whether, nose in, figure out, but how do you how do you differentiate on this? You talked about looking at the detailed plans of families. Like, how far do you go? What makes sense? And then the second part just to consider is structuring it. How does setting up a committee, do you need to do that? And even I go a step further, and you want to start putting expertise on the board. Some thoughts from panelists around that.
I can jump in. I guess the advice that I would give is to ensure that the board understands the sector and the issues faced by the sector. I find that often the board might be focusing on the entity itself, and it's important to understand where is this entity in terms of performance across the sector. So understanding the issues across the sector is important, or sectors, because many organizations cross a number of sectors. So it's important to really understand what are the risks, or really what are the opportunities as well, and also what are the performance expectations, because in many cases performance expectations as informed by the stakeholders are being managed or being laid out by what your peers are doing on an issue. If it's animal welfare, what are your peers doing on this issue? And then asking the right questions. Really, boards have the ability of allowing, in some cases, management to take a better view of some of these issues. So by simply asking the question, what is the performance of the sector in CSR? What are some of the major trends? Asking those questions will enable management to do the right level of thinking and research to be able to answer those and demonstrate that they're demonstrating performance in that sector as well.
Yeah, I think from the retail standpoint, and I guess it goes beyond just retail, but being very strategic about and challenging management to build social license into the whole strategic plan, and then it needs to cascade down through whether it be a committee, a special CSR committee, or whether it's an external committee, whether it's through compensation. But there's a lot of touch points that the board has and which need to be extremely actionable. But the first step is challenging management to be very strategic about it.
One last question before we put our audience to work. And it's once again around board composition and dealing with this. And of course, when you think of the issues that arise, we had compensation, and of course, the natural response, well, let's get someone with comp experience on the board. Then then that came through the credit crisis, let's get someone with risk management experience on the board. Question is, with this matter, does it make sense to have a ESG type expert on the board? Is that something people would be thinking about recommending for this particular issue?
I don't think that works, to be honest. I mean, obviously in the mining area you want miners, so a good half of our board are traditional miners, so they've dealt with the issue before. But I don't really think this is an expertise thing as much as a full board responsibility. And if you sort of have an expert like that, I think there's an opportunity to delegate, and I actually don't think this is an item that the board should delegate. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have any contrary views to that?
Wow.
I agree with it.
Yeah.
Wendy, you?
No, I agree with it as well. I guess I would say that it's incumbent upon the board to have a social conscience, both individually and amongst all the directors and as a whole.
So certainly, if nothing else, being educated around the issues
Yeah.
is an important one for the boards to understand and deal with them. Okay, so it is time to put you to work, and here's the question. Is social license a key dimension of risk, or one that ebbs and flows along with society's level of trust in business? Take 7 minutes, and we'll see you after that.